Today I had the pleasure of speaking to Ben Cuker, a professor of marine and environmental studies at Hampton University, and a recently published writer of a book called Diet for a Sustainable Ecosystem. We talked about many things, including the importance and history of the Chesapeake Bay, which the book goes into, the need for diversity in STEM, and our responsibilities in creating a symbiosis with our ecosystems. He takes most of the podcast to walk us through an awesome presentation of his new book. So there's a lot of great information on this one, and I'd suggest checking out the video for this one too, so you can follow along better. Without further ado, Ben Cuker.
I've been a college professor now for 39 and a half years.
Mm-hmm.
I was 7 years at Shaw University, which is a historically black college in Raleigh, North Carolina. And in '88, I came to Hampton University, which is also an HBCU. My work, my science work began in Arctic Alaska. I was actually trained as a freshwater ecologist, so a limnologist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I worked in Arctic lakes in Alaska. Then I worked in North Carolina. I worked on the effects of suspended clay on ponds there, and then transitioned up here into more marine work, estuarine work on the Chesapeake Bay. And I've done zooplankton and benthic work, snails, etc. But more recently, I've become very interested in the whole issue of the dead zone in the Chesapeake Bay, the role of nutrients, creating hypoxia and the whole eutrophication thing. So, but I decided to put together this book, which is at the intersection between the health of the bay and people's health.
Mm-hmm.
And I became a vegan myself just about 7 years ago, and I teach a course for 10 years now. I've been teaching a course called Eating for Healthy You and Sustainable Planet. So it became apparent that we could really understand what happens at the Chesapeake Bay in terms of our food system. And while we sicken the bay, we sickened ourselves. And I try to show the way forward on that through the book, as well as expand on the history of doing so. Mm-hmm. And I have, I guess there's 5 co-authors on the book as well. So I have experts in oysters and crabs, for example, joining me on that. The chapter on organic farming is written by my really good friend from undergraduate school at the University of Michigan. The plastics chapter is written by Rob Hale, who I swam against in high school in Detroit and also lifeguard together. And his graduate student is also on that too. So, when you do stuff like this, it's always good to have a network to draw from.
Yeah.
And we have a chapter in there. I'm not going to be talking about it in the blog because it's 21 chapters, and there's only so much you can talk about.
Yeah.
But the chapter on politics and policy is written by the original head of the Chesapeake Bay program. Chesapeake Bay program is a U.S. EPA headed, but also NOAA and other agencies. That's a central clearinghouse, central organizing place for science on the Chesapeake Bay. So he was actually the original leader of that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's great that he wrote that chapter for us on policy and that.
So how long have you guys been working on the project?
So
writing the book.
It took me about 3 years to write the book.
Mm-hmm.
I started in earnest. I had a sabbatical 2018. So first semester of 2018. And I'd done a little work on it before then, but then got mostly on with that. And the the book was into the publisher just over a year ago, but they got kind of slow with their review process and things, and COVID hit.
Yeah.
And the way publishing works these days is a lot of the work is outsourced. So Springer, the publisher, has a lot of its production in India.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, India was hit big with COVID and that. So it came out. It came out in October, late September, October, which is a little bit, like 6 months later than I anticipated. But considering COVID, it's not. And actually, in a way, it worked out a little bit because I was, as I was going through the proofs, I was able to add in some references to the pandemic.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So, which was nice. It was unfortunate because when I originally planned the book, I was going to have a chapter on zoonotic diseases, diseases that have their origin in animals, which is what COVID is, right? Essentially, all epidemics that humans have ever experienced have had their origins in animals.
Mm-hmm.
And this only really became an issue, in the last couple thousand years, as our history of domestication has expanded.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these epidemic diseases, every single one of them, are of animal origin. I was going to have a whole chapter on that with the Chesapeake Bay and that, but it just, so there's only so much you could do. So,
yeah.
But it would have been very timely. So I mentioned it just a little bit in the book. And I talk about, for example, in the chapter where I get into, I think it's in the sustainability chapter or the chapter where I talk about chickens, I forget. But I do talk about diseases experienced by the workforce that handles food. And I go through a bunch of those. Mm-hmm. I think perhaps in there is where I added in, the big COVID outbreaks on the Chesapeake Bay watershed were on the eastern shore in the meatpacking industry.
Mm-hmm.
And just like the chickens are highly diseased from being packed together, in the CAFOs, the chicken houses, so are the workers from the same thing. Where are you located?
I was going to ask you too. I'm out of Indianapolis right now. Yeah.
Indiana.
Yep.
All right, you guys didn't vote right, but we'll get over it.
Yeah, we were the first to vote wrong. Yeah. We were the first one. Yeah.
So I'm located in Hampton, Virginia, which is located near the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay.
Yeah. I was wondering, even just looking at the picture, what part of the bay you were at.
Yeah. And Hampton is the oldest continuously occupied English settlement in the New World.
That's really cool. That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So it's a very, very historical place. Although, for being such an old place, there aren't that many old structures around because the British burnt Hampton in the War of 1812.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Southerners burnt their own houses, their own businesses, because the Union continued to occupy Fort Monroe, which is part of Hampton or adjacent to Hampton. And rather than have the Yankees have access to their houses, et cetera, they burnt them. So
I didn't know that either. That's wild. That's it.
Yeah, well, if you want to understand, what's going on in our electoral politics today, you could just look back to that event, and it's really, they're still fighting the Civil War.
Really, yeah.
Yeah, so there are a couple old features, but surprisingly, you wouldn't see as much. But this is where it all began. This is where the history of the United States really starts. Is in Hampton, Jamestown, the surrounding area.
Yeah, that's really interesting to like, because I didn't remember that part of like the American history, and that makes it doubly as interesting. Just the impact of the Chesapeake Bay, how it's always kind of been tied to where the U.S. started out.
Yeah. Yeah. It's our foundation stories, you know, John Smith and Pocahontas, all this happened just essentially under my feet where I'm standing, you know, or not too far away.
Yeah.
So what I'm most known for, though, in my field is not my science. I've been doing diversity work.
I saw that. Yeah, I was gonna ask even a couple times while you were talking. I didn't want to interrupt, but I would love to, yeah, if you dive into that.
Yeah. So you know, I talk about this in the introduction to my book, or the forward to my book too. I had the good fortune of being one of 6 white students at Mumford High School in Detroit, which the rest of my classmates were African American, right? And so, and I graduated in 1972 from high school. So I had a bicultural education, which was very useful. And, you know, we spray painted on the side of our high school was Angela Davis High. Well, I don't even, do you know who Angela Davis is?
I don't actually.
You don't really? Okay, well, you need to look up Angela Davis after this. Anyways.
I will, yeah.
So, but, you know, it was in the midst of, you know, this is late 60s, early 70s, the Black Power movement and that. So it was a great time to be there. And they really pre-adapted me for my work at historically Black colleges, since I had familiarity with the culture, you know, who my friends were and stuff. But anyways, starting when I was a student at the University of Michigan, I led efforts to help diversify the place. And when I was working at Shaw back in the early 80s, I pushed our main scientific society, the American Society of Limnology and Oceanography. We've since changed our name, but anyways, to do something about diversity. You know, this is like before email and stuff, so I'd write letters and that kind of thing. And eventually they said, one of my former professors from Michigan became president of the society. And he says, oh, all right, Ben, you get your committee, and of course you're in charge. So out of that, I developed the Aslo Multicultural program. And I bring about 70 diverse students to our meetings every year. And they come from Guam to Puerto Rico and everywhere in between. So these are primarily students of color, you know, very diverse group. And these are students who've done research, they have things to present. And I've run a couple other diversity programs that I've created. One was relevant to the book. It's called Massed Multicultural Students at Sea Together.
I saw that one. I saw that.
And the university had this 53-foot catch, which it came by. I won't go the whole story. Anyways, so I would spend a month with students. Again, these are students from, I guess Hawaii to Puerto Rico and everywhere between. I'd bring a dozen students. Every summer we'd do the Chesapeake Bays. We did marine science, marine policy, the heritage of African Americans under sail, Native Americans on the bay, and seamanship. So I would live with the students along with the boat skipper and the first mate. It's a dozen students for a month, and we'd visit all the important laboratories and
that's awesome.
Museums, and we did our own science, you know. And I actually just have some of the data in my book. In the eutrophication chapter, I show some of the data we collect. Yeah, it was great. Went from 2000 to 2008, but then, you know, the Great Recession hit.
Yeah.
And funding. That was funded, by the way, initially by, I was awarded a Pew Fellowship in Marine Conservation by, basically for my diversity work. So, you know, most of the people who are Pew Fellows work in, species preservation, marine protected areas, that kind of thing. But there are a few of us, who are more outreach, education.
Mm-hmm.
That. And that's a really
STEM, yeah.
The Pew Fellows group, they name about a half dozen Pew Fellows a year. So this is a really select, special group. And I'm way over my head in the kind of people I'm with. Let me tell you, these are the people when you have NPRs on and they're interviewing somebody, it's like, these are my Pew colleagues. So
yeah,
so they're great. And actually, we were supposed to have a physical meeting next week in California, but that's going to be a Zoom event.
Mm-hmm.
But the Pew Fellows are from all around the world, so it's been great, and that helped motivate me to write the book too.
Yeah, it's got to be very awesome and humbling at the same time.
Yeah, humbling, big
group,
time.
Yeah,
yeah, big combination of the two.
Mm-hmm.
If your author wrote books, I need to go write a book too.
Yeah, I'm here for a reason. Yeah, I gotta show my worth. It's good.
Yeah, but so what I wrote this book. It's straight up science. With references to the primary literature and all that. But I wrote it with what I call the educated reader in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of if somebody, had some high school science, they should be able to get it. And I actually have a chapter in there. Chapter 3 is a review of the basic science one would need to understand the rest of the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exact kind of text resources and things. Just again, like the purpose of this podcast that we have wanted to uncover too. Like one of the things I always ask everybody that's on is for texts like that are accessible to people, they can use as like, a bridge to get into any of these fields, where it can kind of run them through either like a historical thing like this and give you all that you need to understand it, or it's very hard to find text like that. So I really need to check it out in full after that.
Yeah. So it's, it's an expensive book, and just that's the way Springer does it because they price it like textbooks.
Mm-hmm.
I argue with him a lot and stuff, but I even came up with some monies I could have used to subsidize.
Mm-hmm.
They were like, no, we're not going to do that.
That's interesting.
So though the Kindle version of the book is pretty cheap.
Mm-hmm.
That's like $16 or $26 or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you could get access that way.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote a chapter for another book called, I think it was on the nature of waters and natural waters. Something like that. And that was in a book on water pollution and health. And this is a great story because what it was is I found my old high school girlfriend from who I hadn't seen since 1972 or heard from, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I happened to look her and find her, and she's living in Ann Arbor, Michigan. She's on the faculty there in the nursing school where my wife got her nursing degree. And she married a guy who just lived down my street. Okay. So it was like this great. So we got back together, and it was just a lot of fun. And she said, "Oh, Ben, I was asked to write this chapter. Would you like to come and write with me?"
Mm-hmm.
I said, "Oh, okay, sure, Rosemary. This will be fun." And so I did that. I co-wrote chapter 3. But then I said, this book needs a basic introduction to water and natural waters.
Mm-hmm.
So the reader can make sense of it. So I went ahead and wrote a chapter on that. So it all came down to my old high school girlfriend, see? And that's out there now too. And I see through ResearchGate, it's getting a good number of reads. So to your point, that's the kind of chapter that would get somebody into it.
Yeah, and I think more things just the fact that when you started that project with her or were in that project and you recognized that the book needed something like that, I
Yeah.
think that's a thing that's missing in a lot of texts that at least I've seen. Again, I didn't graduate through STEM myself. My family is both my parents are biochemists, and the whole family is a big research family. So I grew up around a lot of it and enjoy reading either articles or, like, right now I'm reading a book by just one of the great physics teachers at MIT, and he's just known for being great at just that aspect of being able to ease people in and really open up all their perspectives and, like, let them into this world without it just being such a jump that you can't surpass, or too dry to read. But yeah, I love discovering texts like that.
Are your folks academics?
They both work at so we're originally Bulgarian. We came here when I was 5 years old, and then so they could continue their schooling, we moved to South Bend, Indiana, which is northern where Notre Dame is.
Yeah.
So they could finish or do their doctorates there. They're both biochem. And they were both postdocs there for a little bit. And my mom first, but then now both of them work at Siemens, like the health and ears side. So now they both work there doing, like, my dad's moved slightly more to the engineering side and, like, troubleshooting, but they're like leading teams doing research there, which is really cool. Still, yeah.
Well, I want to thank your parents for helping to enrich the diversity of the country.
Yeah, that's something, a big thing we always talk about and always really appreciate. And yeah, I love that that's a focus of yours. And just having been an immigrant like myself and my family, you obviously tend to surround yourself and you're more comfortable with other immigrants and other. So yeah, definitely an important. My mom was the most upset that the other day when we were the first state turned red. She's like, "What was this is actually the first year we could vote. We all got our citizenship this year." So she's like, "What did I even vote for?" But she's happier now. Yeah.
But Obama won Indiana in 2008.
I didn't remember that. Yeah.
So, what Trump did is he converted the Republican Party to one of white nationalism. And, I found that to be a very successful model. And, and I don't see the Republicans moving away from it because, they can't claim fiscal responsibility or any of those kinds of things. So they're basically, it's about white nationalism and, sort of right-wing values. Let me put it that way.
So it's been a while. Anyways. Yeah. Back to, again, yeah. Thank you for, I guess, appreciation. I know my parents would be grateful. They love it here for sure.
Yeah. Well, my 3 of my 4 grandparents were immigrants from the border lands between Russia and Poland for a couple of them, and then the other was Austro-Hungary, and
so a fellow Slav. Okay, yeah.
And then my grandfather, who was born in the U.S., he was Hungarian as well. So we a Jewish family from the Pale, etc. Yes.
Yeah.
So my name, Cuker, it's most people pronounce it as Cuker, but it's Cuker.
Oh, yeah?
Which you probably recognize as a version for sugar, right?
Oh, yeah.
Zukar or sakar. Do you know the Bulgarian, what it would be for sugar?
But in Bulgarian, it's zahar. Like
Zahar,
zahar.
Zahar. It's one of those root words.
Yeah, it's interesting how many, yeah.
Yeah, we have cousins that have an I in there, Cukaier.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but it's when my grandfather came over to Ellis Isle, his name was Cuker, and they said, "Oh, that sounds like not foreign enough." So they changed it to Zuckerman.
Really?
And after World War II, when my dad got out of the Navy, he changed it back to what he thought was the spelling.
Yeah.
but he left out the I apparently. So there we are.
Yeah, that's so cool seeing how it can change over time. Just that. Yeah. But yeah, back to yeah, either your story or yeah, we can dive into this whenever as well. I think you were talking about where were we actually? Because you were talking about like the expedition trip you used to do with students.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think where we veered off. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So we talked. Yeah. And I had another program to try to get more students of color into the doctorate, and that was a program between Old Dominion University and Virginia Institute of Marine Science and Hampton University. And we had a good, I don't know, close to 40 students through the program. But I don't know, what do we have, 6, 7 PhDs out of? I was kind of disappointed in our PhD production. A lot of master's students. And, you know, essentially neither of those institutions have any people of color on the faculty. And things aren't going to change until that happens. Right. So, you know, I did what I could do, but I was just facing a lot of internal resistance, you know, from those places. And yeah, so we got some good people through the program, but it's not easy work. I wrote a piece called George Floyd in the Aquatic Sciences, by the way, which was published by the Bulletin for Limnology and Oceanography this summer. That might be interesting for you also.
Yeah, I'll definitely put that in the things like that. I'm definitely going to put in the show notes for sure for people, like in the description.
Yeah.
I'll find links.
Yeah, let's see. Let's see if I could show you. Oops, that's not it. Let's see. Oh. All right. Well, maybe we should just go ahead and get on with this.
Yeah. We can go ahead and kick it off. I can. Yeah, I'll make sure to email you afterwards to get the link to that piece, and we can include it.
All right. So I just need to go into my slideshow and start talking.
I guess so. Yeah. Oh, for questions, would you rather? Because I'm sure I'll have a good bit. I can wait till the end. I don't know if you
can come in on the questions, because I think that you know, I just gave a talk at University of Georgia a couple weeks ago, and of course that was traditional and the questions were at the end. But you know, it's funny when you're doing the Zoom talk because you just don't have any feedback.
Yeah, you can't really see my cues or anything.
Right. So yeah, actually, you're coming in and having, you know. I looked at one of the blogs and noticed that you were doing that, right? Or it wasn't you, but there was another, was it Kelly who was doing the sort of interview with the blog?
I'm the one always in the video, or like the one always talking to the person. But it's yeah. So it could have been one of the guests.
Okay, but I noticed there was exchange. So.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, feel free to do so, because I had the sense from what I watched that this is on the less formal side. Could that be?
Yeah. Usually this is actually our first one that's like a presentation. Usually it's just I'm sitting down, kind of discussing with them. We'll go from, you know, more the broad fundamentals into some of their current more technical research, and then we'll just talk kind of the future, philosophical questions, all that. But I'm actually really excited that this is one of our first where there'll be it'll be structured as a presentation, and I can ask you things throughout to kind of break things down for myself and anybody watching, and then we can do any of those other questions afterwards too.
Well, good. We'll take it out for a test sale here.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah.
we go. Well, thank you for joining me today and for the invitation to be here. Margo, it's great. You're doing a great service, providing timely information on marine systems to the general public. What I'm going to talk about today is a book that I just had published. It's called Diet for a Sustainable Ecosystem: The Science for Recovering the Health of the Chesapeake Bay and Its People. And the book is published by Springer, and you can get it through Amazon. I have a link up here for that. And I'll say that Springer kind of priced it high, like a textbook. However, Amazon has less expensive ways of getting it. I think you can download it to your reader for like $36 or something like that. So it's not too bad. But anyways, the book is about the intersection between a particular marine system, and that's the Chesapeake Bay, and people's health. Essentially, our food system is killing us, and it's killing the Chesapeake Bay. But it does not have to be this way. So when I assembled this book, and I have multiple co-authors too. Okay, this isn't just my own efforts, but some very good folks that came in and on this project. I try to tell a holistic story, and one that approached science and history from something that was not a masculine European centric approach, but something that took a broader, more encompassing approach. And this is embodied in ecofeminism. And there were 4 really important women inspiring this work. I want to mention Rachel Carson first. She is considered the mother of the environmental movement. And of course, in 1962, she published Silent Spring. And this book basically uncovered the effects of pesticides, not only on the natural world, but also on the human population, particularly in the United States. And of course, it's titled Silent Spring because the wide use of DDT and other pesticides by the early 1960s meant that bird populations were way down. And she unfortunately died just a couple years later of breast cancer. And many cancers are associated with pesticides, so a bit of an irony, but she was one great inspiration. And the title of the book is an homage to Frances Moore LePay. In 1971, Frances Moore LePay published Diet for a Small Planet. And she was not trained as a scientist, but she did great science, pioneering work. So she was a young graduate student, and at Berkeley with a slide rule, she went through the Food and Agricultural Organization reports, and she discovered the problem of food in the world wasn't that there wasn't enough, just that we were not distributing it appropriately, and that so much of the food production was going to feed animals rather than to feed people. And she is still very active in the field. She's written a lot more, so a great inspiration, Frances Moore LePay. Then Vandana Shiva, who's from India. She's a PhD in physics, but she was really one of the mothers of the worldwide environmental movement, and really took on the so-called Green Revolution that changed India's agricultural system and brought massive poverty to the farmers there, and that she's written over 20 books. So she was also a big inspiration, and she also coined the term of ecofeminism. And then finally, on a more local note, Dr. Grace Brush, who is a really top scientist on the Chesapeake Bay, and uses sediments to figure out what happened in the past. So these four women are big inspirations in having this book together.
Mm-hmm. For Vandana Shiva, do you have if someone wants to get started, you said you had many books. Do you have one that you recommend people start at if they want to learn more?
Soil, Not Oil.
Soil, Not Oil. Okay.
Okay. But there's a lot out there, you know.
Gotcha.
And they're very accessible, and you can get them for, you know, very little on Amazon, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Soil, Not Oil is just one of my favorites of hers.
Gotcha.
In assembling this book, again, in taking the theme of an ecofeminist perspective, the story is about the Chesapeake Bay and what happened to it and its people. But we can really only understand that story if we address issues of race, class, migrant status, etc. So woven throughout the book, I try to make the point of the role played by people of color. And of course, this has changed over time. After all, the Chesapeake Bay is, you know, at the founding node of the American experience. And of course, that experience included slavery, and throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed, slavery was certainly extant, particularly in the southern end of it. So the food system, of course, was worked by enslaved peoples, and after emancipation, also by people of color. And in more recent years, there's been a move away from African Americans in the food system into migrant workers coming from Mexico and Central America. So the book's 21 chapters, and there's no way I'm going to be able to summarize all 21 for you. But I want to tell some stories. And so we'll be talking story, as some of our first Americans would say. And I'm starting here. This is in Annapolis, Maryland, on the Chesapeake Bay. And this is Alex Haley, who wrote the book Roots, which hopefully you're familiar with. So first question you really have to ask is, so what is the Chesapeake Bay? If you're not from the region, it may not really click for you. So let's just spend a few minutes talking about that. So here we are in the mid-Atlantic region of the United States. And this is the Chesapeake Bay where it's located. And from a satellite, this is what it would look like. I'm coming to you from Hampton University. Actually, I'm coming to you from my house today because of COVID, but not too far from Hampton University where I work. And this is located the lower part of the Chesapeake Bay. Oh, you know what? Actually, my arrow should be down here. Unfortunately, I moved Hampton all the way up, but it's down here. Okay. And Annapolis is up here. That's where the statue of Alex Haley was in Washington, D.C., where we know there were some big changes, not soon enough. There's Baltimore. And this is what we call the Delmarva Peninsula, because it's made up of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. That's the Delmarva Peninsula, also known as the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay. And this chicken is here because that's what the Eastern Shore's food system is all about these days, is all about broilers, which we'll get into in a little bit. So the bay has a very large watershed considering the size of the water body, and extends through all these jurisdictions from Virginia, District of Columbia, Maryland, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, and Delaware. This land all drains into the Chesapeake Bay, hence we call it a watershed. And these are the major rivers that drain in these, but there are thousands of other tributaries as well. So it's a very large surface area considering the surface area of the the bay, very large surface area of the watershed, and also the relatively shallowness of the bay, which means that what goes on in the watershed has a very large influence on what happens within the bay. There's 18 million people that live in this watershed, and there's about the bay itself was created about 15,000 years ago. So during the last glacial maxima, much of the water in the ocean had moved through evaporation into the atmosphere and then deposition onto the land. And because it was so cold, it stayed frozen. So during the last glacial maxima, there was this big, massive movement of water from the oceans onto land. And of course, as land began warming up again, the glaciers melted. And what was the ancient Susquehanna River valley became flooded to make the Chesapeake Bay. So it's a relatively young geological feature, about 15,000 years old at best.
Yeah, that's younger than what I guessed.
And the Susquehanna River is important because it constitutes about 50% of the flow, freshwater flow coming into the bay. So what goes on in the watershed from the Susquehanna River, which is Pennsylvania and New York, essentially, a little bit of Maryland, that's what really influences what happens in the bay. It is the largest estuary in the U.S. Its mean depth is 7 meters, that's about 22 feet, and it has a very extensive coastline. Now, the bay is an estuary, and by this we mean that there's a mixing of ocean water, this is the Atlantic Ocean out here, and the fresh water coming down from the tributaries. So if you were to take a voyage up the bay, as Captain John Smith did some 400 years ago, and measure the salinity of the surface waters as you went, it would go from near the salinity, full salinity of the ocean, which is about 34 parts per thousand, eventually up into fresh water at the top of each of the tributaries. So there's this gradient that exists up the full axis of the bay and each of the oops, here we go. Tributaries, thank you. Okay. Now, the bay stratifies from top to bottom. That means that less dense water tends to float on the top of the bay, while denser water is on the bottom. And water is less dense when it's warmer and when it's fresher. It's denser, it will sink when it's colder and saltier. Okay. So the bay stratifies on an annual basis for, probably 8 months of the year. Like this particularly stratifies hard during the summer months. And this sets up the conditions for low oxygen conditions or hypoxia in the bottom waters, which we'll talk about more. So let's just take a quick look at estrogen circulation. So to orient you, here's the land. Okay, this would be like Pennsylvania, New York. This could be the Susquehanna River draining down into the bay, and this will be all the way down here at the mouth of the bay. Okay, so fresh water is flowing down the river by gravity, joins the bay, continues to flow out. As it flows out, this is not intuitive at all, but it actually transfers energy to the saltier marine waters underneath and drive those waters in the opposite direction. Okay, this is not what one would think. That's how it actually works. So the driving of flow of fresh water going out of the bay drives marine waters up the bay. And the marine waters, when they come from the mouth of the bay, they go deeper and deeper. And that's a process of subduction underneath the fresh waters. So you see the wedge here, that it's fresher water on top, saltier on the bottom. We call this a saltwater type wedge estuary. Okay, and there's not all that much mixing between the two layers, a little bit. Now, something else to point out is there's enough light for the photosynthesis in the top few meters of the water column, and that's it. because the bay is turbid. It absorbs a lot of particles suspended in the clay, a lot of colored elements in the water, absorbs a lot of light. So the deeper portions of the bay don't get light, which means that they're not getting the benefit of photosynthesis to produce oxygen, and they're also physically isolated from renewal of oxygen coming from the surface because of the stratification. And that sets up the conditions for low oxygen conditions.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so that's the bay. And the second story I'm going to tell is about how colonialism comes to the Americas. So Captain John Smith leads 3 ships coming from England in 1607. And he meets the Powhatan people, and here is Chief Powhatan, illustrated there. Captain John Smith, he is quite a character. He was not actually a captain of a ship. He was a captain in the army, and he was a mercenary. And despite being just in his 20s when he does this, he was widely traveled around Europe and into Asia, and been captured a couple times, all sorts of wild stories. But he was definitely a remarkable figure. So the Virginia colony came about because the powers in London, and this was a combination of royalty and wealthy merchants, wanted a colony in the New World. Because by this point, after all, in 1607, the New World had been settled by the Spanish and the Portuguese. For 100 years. Mm-hmm. And the English were like watching the Spanish bring back all this gold and silver from the New World, and they wanted a piece of it. So they tried a colony in Roanoke it's almost 40 years before this, that eventually failed, the lost colony in North Carolina. But they tried again and sent these 3 ships. They had basically 2 missions. One was to set up a colony, and the other was to look for a passage for the trade route to China and Japan. Okay. So because of the previous colony that had failed, they knew that the Algonquin people, and the Powhatans are part of the Algonquin, were skilled farmers and hunters, and they produce an excess of food. So they were sent only with only a few months of food provisions. And they were expected to trade with the Algonquin Indians and also to engage in some fishing and hunting and eventually agriculture themselves to feed themselves. Well, that did not work. So the very first thing that happened when Captain John Smith hit the shores of the Chesapeake Bay is he ended up engaging in a firefight. Arrows and bullets flew. And that characterized the tense relationship he had with the Native Americans, the colony did for the years to come. Eventually, by 1625, 80% of the original colonists had died, and most of them from starvation or diseases associated with it. And in turn, the colonizers practiced genocide on the native peoples and all but eliminated them of their presence from the Chesapeake Bay. There are still members of the Algonquin tribes resident here that never left, but the numbers are very small. And in 1619, sort of by accident, they ended up also establishing chattel slavery, what became chattel slavery in the US, when slaves were captured by a privateer and brought to Jamestown. And they also introduced the first domesticated animals for food and work. Native Americans only had domesticated dogs, and that was it. And by the way, a little aside here. So it's estimated that something like 90% of the original native population in the New World died from introduced diseases when the Europeans first showed up. And these are all zoonotic diseases, those that came from animal husbandry, because there was no previous evolution with the native peoples of the New World and close association with these animals. The diseases spread very quickly and took a big toll. And perhaps it accounted for the low population encountered by Captain John Smith, although that's a bit disputed. So Captain John Smith was a great chronicler of information. And of course, he was sent there to promote the colony. So he was going to say nice things about it. But one of the things he noted was how clear the Chesapeake Bay was. You know, it's illustrated. In truth, these illustrations really come from 40 years before, from the original colonization effort just south of the bay in North Carolina. Theodore Bray's coloring work here of John White's drawings, but everybody uses them, including John Smith himself in his publications, use them to illustrate the bay, because it was the same people, the Algonquin and similar systems. But anyways, he described the Chesapeake Bay as being very clear. He could navigate his ship and his smaller boat easily up and down the bay because he could see where the shoal, the shallow areas were through the clear waters. He could see the extensive oyster reefs, the extensive grass beds, the unending schools of fish. And this was quite different from his experience growing up in post-medieval Europe, because by that point, all of European rivers had been heavily fished, contaminated with pollution from agriculture, and he had seen nothing like this in his experiences. He also celebrated the health of the native peoples. And here are illustrations of the Algonquin, you know, and they're drawn as tall and strong. They're taller than the average Englishman of the time. The women were described as very strong. They were responsible for agriculture. The men were hunters, and they were very fleet of foot and trim. Very unlike the English who came with their diet. This, of course, attributes in large part to the food system the Algonquin people had. Now, I know many of you are maybe tuning into this trying to figure out what's going on with the Chesapeake Bay, and you're hearing me talk about the food system. Well, the point of this book is that we can only understand what happened to the Chesapeake Bay by understanding the food system, because this is what really caused it to decline. And we can also only understand what happened to the people of the bay by looking at the food system. And the solution to both problems are the same. So this is why we're talking about the food system. Mm-hmm. So Captain John Smith encountered and wrote about the Native American food system, the Three Sisters system. And this was extant all across North and Central America, by the way. It originated in Mesoamerica, but through trade, the Indians were very sophisticated people. You have to understand that they had trade routes going down into Mesoamerica, you know, from New England, for example. So these same three sisters appear in basically all Native American settlements across the continent. Corn, which is very calorie rich, a fast growing food. Beans, which were introduced next. And of course, the native folks did not know at the time, but these are nitrogen fixing. They help fertilize the soil. And as you see, the beans would grow up around the corn stalk to provide support for them. And then at the base of the corn and bean plantings, they would plant squash. And squash and their allies have very broad leaves. And of course, that would shade the ground from weeds. So it was a very sophisticated food system. This is a drawing of what their agriculture looked like. and you could see the highly organized fields. Here's some, they're green corn and new corn. They would grow different kinds of corn, and they grew different seasons. Very sophisticated system. And of course, this is completely new world. Europeans knew nothing of maize. It's a new world sort of thing. And they had ceremonies around the corn. Feasting was very important. But corn really became central to the Native American diet. And it really, in the story of the Chesapeake Bay and of the Americas, corn still plays a premier role. Corn is the #1 planted crop in the US, followed by soybean and then by wheat. And although most of it's grown to feed animals now in gasoline engines in gasohol, corn is still an essential part of the theme. Now, the Algonquin did more than do agriculture. And by the way, when Captain John Smith got there, corn had been part of the Algonquin culture for about 500 years. So the Algonquins had been around a lot longer than there was corn, but that changed very much their social structure, and they became more agricultural people when that happened and relied less on gathering and hunting, although gathering and hunting remain important, certainly. And although the population of the Algonquin that Smith encountered was in the tens of thousands in the Chesapeake Bay area, it was very small. They did massive ecosystem engineering, and one of the ways they did this, their primary way, was through the fire management. So they would regularly burn forests in order to clear the land. They would do a burning. This is like a swidden agriculture, which is very, very common throughout the developing world. So they burn land that would provide nutrients to the soil, clear the land, and then would grow a crop for a year or two and then move on to another area. But fire was also used to concentrate game in the fall. So the Algonquin would spread out in a very planned way, light fires that would drive the game to a central location into like a funnel where their hunters were made easy work of them. And fire, of course, was important in cooking. And they didn't eat, they ate popcorn, they invented popcorn, but they didn't eat corn like we eat corn today. They would take the whole cob and boil it down for all day long. Okay, so they got the nutrition from the entire cob, and they had stews, and you can see in this stew is illustrated some fish was added. They also used fire for preservation of meat, particularly fish. They invented smoked fish, for example, for the Europeans.
I don't know either of those. That's awesome.
And they were expert hunters. So this is what this illustrates here. They're hunting deer and that. And they were hunters of both game and of men. And I say men specifically because it was outside the cultural norms of the various Indian tribes to slay any women or children. And they had, war was a constant thing. We shouldn't romanticize the Native Americans as being completely poisoned by the arrival of Europeans, bringing violence and all that. They had plenty of their own violence. Captain John Smith noted there were far fewer men in his counts than there were women because the men were always casualties of war. Mm-hmm. And the cities, the little towns, villages, often they had little stave fences up to deter the archers, picking them off, that sort of thing. When they did go to war, though, it was not over land so much, but it was more over women and children, interestingly. And they would take the women and children from the other side, incorporate them into their own, into their own villages. And if you consider the genetics of it, if you have very closely interbreeding people, then you have the deleterious genes emerge, homozygosity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So often cultures that are island-like very much embrace bringing new genetic material into the population. They didn't think of it as such, but this is why Polynesian women were very welcoming of Western men, for example, when they came, because it was within the culture that if you had somebody foreign to come, then let's bring their genes in the gene pool. So interestingly, and Captain John Smith's wars, and it wasn't just him; it was the European wars with the Native Americans, hinged in part because he didn't get that. So Chief Powhatan actually said to him, none of your men are taking our women as their wives. Okay, so he was defying the norm in that way.
Mm-hmm.
So you see that that gender, it really influences things as they go. So eventually, colonialism succeeds. It succeeded because the Algonquin were murdered, they died of disease, they were displaced from their lands. The first war between the Algonquin and Captain John Smith was over corn, literally.
Mm-hmm.
So with the better technology of weaponry and the arrival of new people to replace those that are dying of starvation, eventually the colonists overcome the Algonquin, take their lands. And in 1609, as illustrated in the panel down here on the right, as I mentioned before, slaves come onto the scene, and the food system gets reshaped. They had, very early on, the Europeans were bringing in indentured servants that would work for 7 years of indenture and then have their freedom. And these, of course, became replaced eventually by enslaved people enslaved for their lives, entire lives, and their children, making it chattel slavery.
Were the indentured servants African American or from?
No, largely not. They were other Europeans, mostly from England, and they were poor. And it was a way for them to get to the New World, have a new beginning. The English social structure at the time was so highly class stratified, and there was just a lot of poverty. They populated Australia with the convicts, and the convicts, of course, were debtors' prison people. So they had this tradition of having a substantial population of poor people that needed places to go to seek a decent living, and they came as indentured servants. And the H-1 visa system we have now in the U.S. is really almost a throwback to indentured servanture, except that you don't get to stay at the end. You still can't decide to change who you work for. Okay, you still can't do that. But even when you finish, if you're on a visa, you got to go back home, right? Indentured servants had a little bit better.
Yeah, that sucks. Thinking about it that way.
Yeah. So so they introduced slavery. They introduced over-harvesting of animal resources. Again, they were not co-evolved with the resources, so they didn't understand, limits as much. And also, the Europeans were very restrictive on the amount of hunting they would allow in Europe, and the game belonged to the royalty and that sort of thing. So there was sort of, we're free now, so we can kill as many deer as we want. That was the attitude. And they did a lot of habitat destruction. They drained wetlands to build housing and expand farm fields. And they built dams for the food system, the grist mills to grind the grain. The Europeans were very, used to eating bread as the main source of calories. So that meant growing wheat and other grains and grinding them with a grinding wheel. The mills did other work too, with lathes and that, but it was really a food system thing. So they constructed all these dams, which checked the migration of migratory fish, which was really important. And that really helped lead to the decline. It wasn't just overfishing, but dam construction. And they introduced animal agriculture. Again, Native Americans did not know of animal husbandry, other than they had dogs, and that was it, to help them hunt. And so the ideas of pigs and chickens and all that oxen that were brought, that was totally new for Native Americans. By the way, this is a scene down here, which may be the good people of Hampton, Virginia, murdering the Powhatan's people that they tricked into coming to a feast. A very famous massacre. All right. So that was the beginning. So our nation is being founded. The food system is now largely in the hands of people of color, not getting paid for their work. And the population is expanding, both by immigration and both by local growth. So along comes technology. And technology does two things. It makes the harvesting of the animals that much more efficient. And very importantly, it makes that much more efficient the transportation of those harvested animals to a new market. See, it was one thing when people would just kill animals to feed themselves and their families and maybe their neighbors. And it was a wholly different thing when animals were harvested en masse to place on railroads or in steamer ships, preserved with ice brought in from northern states, to send to distant markets. So here's the railroads of mid 19th century. And this is in Hampton. This is about a mile or so from where I'm standing, maybe 2 miles. This is all oyster shells. Okay. Oh. So it shows you the extent of oyster harvesting. And this is Darlene's oyster business. Okay. And I talked about the mills that were built. This is the last remaining tide mill on the Chesapeake Bay. This is interesting. It's not where you build an impoundment and let the water out to turn the wheel. This is turned by the water comes in on a tidal flow. You put some boards down, trap the water, and the water goes back, turns the mill. And John Lennon and Yoko Ono bought this in January of 1980, but unfortunately John Lennon was killed by Mark Chapman in December of 1980, so that they never lived at in the attendant mansion with it. A little bit of beetle history for the Chesapeake Bay.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know that at all.
Yeah. All right. So what happened? Well, fisheries collapsed in the bay. Again, overharvesting and dam construction, habitat loss. That was the main things. And I want to point out, this is more recent as it goes. I'm not stretching way back in history here. But let's start in 1950 to current day. And this is the total commercial landings from the Chesapeake Bay. So this is not sport fishing, which is huge in the bay as well. So they pump these numbers up more. But these are total commercial landings in metric tons. And you can see there's a lot of metric tons of fish coming out every year of the bay. So look what dominates most of the harvest. It's a fish called Menhaden. And I suspect most of you out there in blog land have never heard of the Menhaden fish, right?
I have not.
Okay, and Menhaden, it's the largest catch on the east coast of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'll talk about a little bit more about Menhaden in a minute here. The founding fish for the nation were the Sturgeon and Shad. Sturgeon are very large fish. And the Atlantic sturgeon, the sturgeon were essentially all but eliminated from European waters, from over harvesting. And they were considered a royal fish. In other words, if you caught sturgeon, they belong to the crown. And they were loved for their flesh and for their eggs, caviar, right?
Oh, okay.
And you can see that the sturgeon population, this is metric tons. So their removal in 1882, and eventually, fishing got stopped. But just, the population of sturgeon is very tiny now. They're protected. Okay. And the green is commercial, and this is dead bycatch. In other words, accidental catching of sturgeon are showing up here, but there was no legal catching of sturgeon. Shad and river herring and alewife, these are all colpeids. These are suspension feeding fish, filter feeding fish, as are the menhaden, by the way. Okay, so they're eating phytoplankton, zooplankton, some detritus, small particles in the water. Well, it's said that the spring run of sturgeon in 1610 saved Jamestown from starvation when they came back in. And then, of course, the shad followed. But you can see what's happened to the populations, starting in the 1880s. These fish are way down, over harvesting. And again, the dams mean habitat destruction. They couldn't go upstream to spawn. Albert Spells is an employee of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and he's working with sturgeon habitat restoration. So let's talk specifically about the menhaden, the fish that I think the title of my chapter is the fish that the unpalatable fish that nobody eats but everybody does.
Yeah.
Okay, so this fish, the menhaden, as you can see here, they're swimming in schools with their mouth open, and they're filtering the water, and they provide the ecosystem service of reducing the plankton in the water, helping the water being clear. Okay, but they also provide the ecosystem service of being everybody's favorite food in the bay. So they're really oily fish, and they're oily because the diatoms they eat, these phytoplankton, they store their energy as oil, and they concentrate it in their tissues. And this is, when we talk about fish oil, talk about, I take fish oil supplements. This is what they're talking about, basically, oils that originated in diatoms in the algae. And striped bass love to eat them. All the fishing birds love to eat them. Weakfish, all the predatory fish of the bay love to eat striped bass. They're so full of energy, energy rich. Well, so menhaden, the name menhaden is a corruption of the Wampum word for fertilizer. Okay, so those are New England Indians. So the Native American populations of the East Coast, and menhaden extend all the way from New England down into the Gulf of Mexico, by the way. They understood this fish is not one would eat because it's so bony and just stinky and doesn't taste good. But they used it directly as fertilizer, fertilizer fields with it. And in New England, they began a reduction fishery for menhaden because the oils could be, they boil the fish down and squeeze the flesh, and the oil would be used for lighting lamps and lubrication and waterproofing. And then the fish meal that was left would be fed to chicken and pigs. And so this is why I say nobody eats menhaden, but everybody has, because menhaden is used as animal food. So if you've ever eaten a chicken or a pig, you've eaten menhaden. However, now it's mostly used for in aquaculture, because aquaculture, fish produced in aquaculture bring a lot higher price than chicken or pig meat. So that's where most of it goes now. But a guy named Thomas Reed brought an operation down to Reedville, what's now Reedville, Virginia, and there were over like 24 Menhaden factories located on the area around Reedville. And here's a smokestack remaining from one of the old factories. And this really reeks. The locals call it the smell of money when they're doing the reduction fishery. But you can see the striped bass landings are way down, and striped bass fishers will tell you it's because the Menhaden populations are depleted. And this is a very political issue on the bay. And just recently, the state political authorities relinquished control to fisheries managers of the Menhaden industry. But I have a whole chapter on this. And again, this industry was worked by men of color. Mm-hmm. These were the sons of emancipated slaves, etc. So white boat captains generally, but black hands doing all the heavy lifting. Okay. Now, oysters were the #1 cash crop of the bay. And you could see what the oyster fleet looked like. I think this is Baltimore. Yeah, it is Baltimore. Just all the oyster skipjacks there. And the oyster houses with their shuckers, okay, separating the meat from the shell. Oysters are so important that there were actually wars fought over the oysters. And there are several books published about the oyster wars of the Chesapeake Bay, where they would do these operations at night to avoid the oyster police. And the boatsmen had cannons and guns, and they fired upon each other, and they would Shanghai people out of Baltimore, force them to work, and then toss them over the side. You know, it was quite a colorful time.
Yeah, I'd heard of that book.
So oysters were the foundation species for the bay. Remember, Captain John Smith talked about seeing the extensive oyster reefs. So while Native Americans certainly harvested oysters, these were those that they could basically walk in the water and retrieve, or maybe dive down and pick up a few. But they had a very small impact on the overall oyster population. And these oyster reefs were the home to dozens of different species of fish and invertebrates. And they came up through the waters on low tide. You could see them. But the way oysters were harvested is the oysters would be brought onto the boat, and they would be sorted ashore. And the shell was a resource too. So these reefs were fished down and down, further and further, with each pass of a trawl. And eventually, the once dominant oyster reefs of the bay are essentially gone. So we're down to about 3% of what the population used to be. And it's said that it's calculated that the original oyster populations could filter the bay in about a week. And now that comes up to, doesn't happen in a whole year.
That's insane.
So in addition to the fishing and the oysters, there was also a large overhunting of birds. And I want to start with passenger pigeon. So the most common bird in North America in 1865 was the passenger pigeon. There was something like 5 billion of them. By 1902, they were completely extinct. So passenger pigeon, they're not closely related to pigeons as you know them. These are larger birds. They would mate for life, mate in pairs. And unfortunately, they would only lay 1 or 2 fertile eggs a year. So they had very, very low capacity to recover from population declines, even though their population was so massive. And although the Native Americans and the early colonists lived in fairly good harmony with passenger pigeons. I mean, when these would fly over and they would darken the sky for like an hour at a time as their migrations went through. The numbers were still strong in 1865, 5 billion, right? So what happened? Well, again, the same thing that happened to the oysters and to the fish, we had technology come on the scene, technology for easier harvesting and then transportation of the catch or the bag. So what I show on this side of the screen was once the tallest building in all of the United States between 1824 and 1884. And that was the Phoenix Shot Tower. Shot towers were invented in England by a plumber there. But basically, you go to the top and you boil up a cauldron of lead, and you pour the lead through a screen, and as it pours through the screen, it breaks up into small droplets. And as the droplets tumble down the distance of the tower, they form perfect little spheres. And at the bottom, there's a pool of water where that collects the lead and keeps it from being dented, right, as it hits. And then children would go and collect the lead for lead shot. So this is what were put in shotguns. And the idea is you'd send out a spray of these tiny pellets to kill birds and larger pellets to kill larger animals. So there's a million bricks in this thing. It shows you how important hunting was to be the tallest building in the United States for that period of time. Mm-hmm. And so through hunting and then sending these birds off to market gunning, et cetera, the population went to extinction. You could look at old menus from fancy hotels and restaurants from the 19th century, all featuring pigeons, usually sold as mated pairs, stuffed for you to dine on. Very sad. And what's left now is just a few words in the English language, like a stool pigeon, is somebody who, snitches on you. Well, stool pigeons were used to attract the pigeons for coming in that. So, and clay pigeons, it all comes out of that. Mm-hmm. Okay, but it was pigeons were easy. They weren't even a sport. They're easy to kill. But the powerful people of the Chesapeake Bay, the politicians, the wealthy, their main sport was hunting waterfowl. And they saw what happened to the passenger pigeon. Legislation that was introduced was way too late, went extinct. So they saw the same thing coming to their beloved waterfowl, because market gunning, like this is a market gun here, mm-hmm. would kill, tens or hundreds of birds at a time, more market guns. And again, the idea of harvesting for market. So they got together and they passed, the first interstate environmental law in the United States. And that was the Migratory Bird Act Treaty of 1918, because they didn't want to see happen to their beloved waterfowl what happened to the passenger pigeon. Mm-hmm. And it was tough to get this through. Its first rendition was struck down by the Supreme Court. It was universally opposed by the senators in the southern states. Why? Because this was the nose of the camel under the tent. They understood if a federal law would supersede state laws, this would be the beginning of the end of the Jim Crow laws that sustained post-slavery social structure of the South. So here's an environmental law. The first important environmental law is also the beginning of what helped end Jim Crow. All right, the next story I'm talking about is the war on nature. Okay. So World War II happens, and a very bloody conflict and a highly industrial technological conflict. And it brings, it sets up in motion the complete industrialization of the agricultural system, the food system in the United States and really around the world. So literally the same plants that were used to produce munitions for the war were converted to producing nitrogen fertilizer and pesticides for after the war. You know, war was won went out with the big technology of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, you know, people in 1944 were in awe of what technology could do. And they really appreciated that war technology being turned toward what they thought were peaceful prospects. But instead, what we did is we brought a war nature home in 1945. And this war in nature is all about sustaining high intensity agriculture, where there's too much production per unit of land, which requires the addition of artificial fertilizers, pesticides, because after all, you're growing these rich crops that invite lots of insects to come and eat them. And also you're fertilizing the land, so that grows weeds as well as the desired crops. So pesticides come on the scene. And then it takes a lot of energy to synthesize those nitrogen-containing fertilizers and the pesticides, and to transport all this, et cetera. So it's a huge energy subsidy. So when you eat from the American food system, understand that you're looking at 11 times more calories coming from fossil fuels than coming directly from sunshine and photosynthesis, which is a completely unsustainable ratio, right? And of course, it requires lots of water, lots of irrigation. So, as I mentioned before, it was the English that introduced domesticated animals. So they became part of the food system. And they became part of the food system in two very important ways. Perhaps first more as labor, and then later on, secondarily, more as food. So some 70% of the watershed of the Chesapeake Bay was cleared by 1900. And think about that. There were a few steam-driven farm implements at the time. Gasoline engines were just coming on the scene. After all, in 1900, the automobiles were split evenly between those driven by steam, those driven by electricity, and those driven by gasoline engines. So electric cars superseded gasoline cars, by the way. So anyways, all that clearing was done pretty much with animal labor and human labor. So that points out how important animals were. And you might recall at the end of the Civil War, Grant promised, actually it wasn't Grant, but it was Sherman, right, promised 40 acres and a mule to all the newly emancipated slaves, 40 acres to grow the crops, and of course the mule to help with the labor. So animal labor is always very important. And of course, pigs and then later chickens so much. So we, of course, moved away from animal labor in the 20th century. Although there are farmers from the mid-1960s who will still tell you about using mules, but it's becoming part of a more distant past now. But of course, we became all about eating animals. And the first animals to show up in Jamestown were pigs and chickens, as well as the mules and the horses for labor. But you've heard of earmarking, like earmarking a bill in Congress. That all comes from the pigs that were brought here. So rather than using the European tradition, the English tradition of confining the pigs and feeding them, the English simply let the pigs run wild and would go out and hunt them down when they wanted to eat them. Well, the Indians figured out it was a good thing to do. And the legislature in Virginia in the early days specified earmarks, in other words, cuts put in the ears of the pigs to identify them as to who they belong to. This led to the development of Smithfield Foods, the largest meat processing people in the area. And the pigs were very much a large part of the Chesapeake Bay food system until we got into the middle part of the 20th century or that. And then it became chickens. So let's look at U.S. animal consumption since 1905. So total animal products consumed per capita per year. So this would be meat, dairy, fish, all combined.
That's per person per year?
Per person per year, okay. And look, we've gone up like, from, additional 30% or 50% really, okay. We're up, so another half up, okay. So we're eating a lot more meat than our ancestors did 100 some years ago. And of this, the proportions of the kind of meat we eat, animal products we eat, has really changed. So in 1900, circa 1900, the main portion was dairy. And that's because dairy, of course, is so much water, right? Mm-hmm. So that kind of skews how much by mass it is, okay? Because it's the wet mass, it's on here. But then, of course, beef was very important as well. And of course, pigs have always, and they still to remain about 15% of the consumption. Seafood has sort of steadily been in there, but never really more than 5% of the diet, right? But let's take a look at poultry. In the early years, chicken was just for Sunday night dinners. And as a child growing up, I remember this. It was a once a week thing. So the original chickens that were brought to the New World were not brought to eat directly. They were brought to supply eggs. Mm-hmm. So people would eat eggs. When the chickens would get old, they'd be spent. They would eat them. The excess males, what they called spring hens, they'd eat them. And there was a tradition of fried chicken and this sort of thing came out of Southern cuisine, which traces back to African slave roots. But anyways, they were not eaten for their meat. They were basically raised for their eggs primarily. But this has all changed. Look at what's happened to poultry. It's gone from 5% to 25% of all the animal mass consumed. Okay, so a 5-fold increase. Okay, and this all traces to a woman named Cecilia Steele. And in about 1918 or so, electric incubators were invented for eggs. And so you could actually order up chicks, okay, to start a new flock of chickens. And that's what she did. And she'd ordered 50 and the train arrived with 500 chicks, okay, by mistake. But she raised them, almost all of them, and it just takes a few months to raise them to market size. And when she did, she put them on a train and sent them to New York City to the kosher markets there for the burgeoning Jewish population. And she sold them at a good profit. And she invented a whole new industry called the broiler industry, the idea of raising chickens primarily to eat and not for their eggs. Mm-hmm. And so 1923, this goes on. Poultry begins to take off, particularly during World War II, because both beef and pork were rationed and people replaced those meats with poultry. So this burgeoning industry really takes off. But at the end of World War II, rationing goes away. People want to go back to eating beef and pork, and there's overcapacity of chickens. So Thomas Jukes comes on the scene, and he's a biochemist, and he figures, okay, we're now growing these new antibiotics, oromycin, and the mash we use to make the oromycin, well, it's just left over, it's high protein, let's just give it to the chickens and feed them. well, wow, the chickens grow really fast, much faster than anticipated, because it's not just the protein from the mash, the bacterial mash, but it's the antibiotic which is changing the flora of the gut of the chicken. So it allows it to grow much quicker. And this ushers in this whole new era of feeding cattle and basically all animal agriculture antibiotics, not because they're sick, but because it adds to their rate of growth by a few percent. And then, of course, then makes those antibiotics that much less effective. And notice that there's also a change in the chicken from 1957 to 2005. After World War II, the AMP chain of supermarkets doesn't really exist anymore, but that was the original big chain. They partnered with the USDA for the Chicken of the Future contest, which was held across 48 states, and they produced these new hybrid chickens, and now they're fed with antibiotics, and this is what we got now. And as I mentioned, the antibiotics used in animal agriculture means that, and 80% of the antibiotics produced in the US until recently went directly to animal agriculture. It means that these same antibiotics that we count on for treating bacterial infections are no longer useful because the development of resistance, evolutionary resistance to the antibiotic. And so, we're now in an era where you're likely to die from in post-op, from surgery, from an infection, or even from a scratch because of the antibiotic-resistant bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
So all these chicken are grown in what are called concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs, and they're CAFOs for pigs as well. But in the Chesapeake Bay, it's really all about the chickens. Smithfield's Foods is located down on the James River, and most of their production is actually happening in North Carolina. There are pig farms, but it's mostly in North Carolina. What the bay is all about are these chicken coops. And I spent a day on Google Earth pinning all of the CAFOs I could see on the Eastern Shore. And you can see you can't drive up the Eastern Shore without encountering these CAFOs for chickens. And here are hoppers for the feed that go in. It's all automated. Basically, they bring in like 30, 60,000 birds into these things as chicks, and they're fed from these watering nipples, and the food is conveyed in, and they have sawdust they're walking in. Well, all this turns into, over the course of a couple months of them living there, and I use that word loosely, living, they're just in their own feces, and it's filled with ammonia in the air. Notice all the big fans at the end here.
Mm-hmm.
This is because the air pollution is horrendous with it. And that's what it's like. Life is like now being a broiler chicken. Note the very green water associated with the drainage from the CAFO. That's from all the nutrients coming off, polluting the water. And of course, these chicken are fed corn and soy. So let's look what happens with the crops that we harvest, okay? And again, what are our most common crops? Corn, followed closely by soy, followed next by hay, and hay, of course, is another animal feed, and then by wheat, and basically wheat's for humans. But 3/4 of what we grow is to feed animals, which we don't need to do, right? Mm-hmm. We just don't even need to eat those animals. Think about it. And then what happens, specifically what happens with corn, okay? Goes to dairy, goes to beef cattle, goes to hogs, goes to poultry, and goes to ethanol production. So very little is actually used for human consumption. Okay, like, you know, something like 8% or 5% of corn produced goes for human production. Okay,
That's wild.
here we go. Human. This includes things like high fructose corn syrup and that.
Mm-hmm.
But oops, sorry. This is a granary in the Western Shore of Virginia, which is owned by Purdue, one of the chickens producers. And all the grain that goes through there is simply to feed their chickens. All right. So we have all this pollution, nitrogen pollution coming from the CAFOs. But, you know, nitrogen is a highly desired fertilizer for what's going on land. So such that there was a big trade in guano beginning in 1832. So these are the deposits left by birds on the Peruvian coast mostly, where it's dry and you have accumulation meters deep, many feet deep of dried bird poop. Guano really rich in nitrogen and fertile in phosphorus too, particularly nitrogen. Okay, so that becomes a part of the Bay's regime. These guano ships come in, bring the guano in, but eventually that's replaced in the Haber-Bosch process of the synthetic nitrogen, which is very energy intensive, and that takes over. And you can see in this illustration, which is from Grace Brush's work I mentioned earlier on, population increases in the bay becomes agricultural and a little more urbanized. Land cover is, you know, switched into agriculture, and nitrogen is laid down from fertilizer purchases. Nitrogen goes way up, and of course, then it shows up coming into the bay. And also at the same time, oyster harvest is going way down. Remember, oysters help filter the bay. So all these wheels are in motion, and the bay becomes too filled with nitrogen. I'll talk about the consequences of that in a couple minutes here. But I mentioned Rachel Carson, who gave a silent spring, captured our attention about what happens with using pesticides, insecticides, and herbicides for the war on nature. DDT was brought home from World War II, and it was used as an insecticide. It was used here for delousing soldiers to kill body lice. And after the war, the chemical agriculture industry said, oh, let's just spray it on our crops and we'll kill all those insects we don't like there. But of course, that kills the beneficial insects as well, and accumulates up the food chain into birds. Big problems. 2,4-D was a weed killer developed for World War II. The thought was the U.S. Army Air Force would spray it over Germany and Japan to cause the starvation of the populations. So it was a chemical agent World War II brought home to kill broadleaf weeds in the industrial intensive agriculture era. So pesticide use in the U.S. has greatly increased. This starts in 1960, and it's also changed in nature. So in 1960, most of the pesticides were insecticides. You know, these were the insects that were competing for us for the crops we were growing. But now look at it, it's mostly herbicides. We're talking Roundup here. Glyphosate, a generalized herbicide that kills basically most plants unless they have a special gene inserted in them, a genetically modified organism, sold also by Monsanto, right? So they're sold as a package. And that's now floods the market. And of course, Monsanto, which was bought by Bayer, is losing lawsuits right and left because Roundup causes non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and other issues. Now, so what crops are receiving all these pesticides? Well, 40% goes for corn. And what does corn go for? Feeding animals, right? Mm-hmm. 21% is going on soy. And what is soy used for? Feeding animals. Okay. And then we get down into things like tomatoes and food that we actually eat. as people, right? But most of it is going to grow crops to feed animals. So it ain't the motion, it is the meat.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now about the story of eutrophication. So the problem that aquatic systems are facing around the world, coastal aquatic systems facing around the world, is that of dead zones or oxygen depletion. And this comes from eutrophication. So eutrophication, and this goes back to a medical term of the 19th century. Doctors describe people if they're displaying eutrophy as being well fed, okay? But German limnologists, freshwater scientists, took the term to describe the nutrient status of lakes initially, and then we understand it also for marine systems. Basically, if there are a lot of inorganic nutrients coming into a system, things like nitrogen and phosphorus, it's going to grow a lot of algae, phytoplankton, and that will support a food chain that lives on that. If it's low in nutrients, the system will be called oligotrophic, and this will provide clear waters with relatively little algae. And most of the photosynthetic production is going to be concentrated on the bottom in terms of like rooted aquatic plants, as opposed to clouding the water on the top. So when these algae grow, they grow so fast that the zooplankton and maybe the menhaden fish that might eat them can't eat them fast enough. So they sink to the bottom. And when they sink to the bottom, they decompose. They're decomposed by bacteria. And the bacteria use oxygen as a terminal electron acceptors, just like we do when we breathe. And that exhausts the bottom waters of oxygen, especially if the water is stratified. You remember the beginning of this talk, I talked about how the bay stratifies in the warmer months, where you have the colder, saltier water in the bottom separated from the fresher, warmer water on top. So oxygen gets used up in the bottom waters, which means that you can't have the fish and crabs and oysters and sponges, etc., that would occupy the deeper waters in an oligotrophic Chesapeake Bay, the one encountered by Captain John Smith with all the clear water. Now we have a eutrophic Chesapeake Bay, and it's driven mostly by nitrogen, nitrogen in the lower bay, and the very upper bay by phosphorus. And these are coming in primarily from the chicken CAFOs, from over-fertilizing of fields, from wastewater treatment plants to some extent as well, some atmospheric deposition as well. But basically, it's our food system, which is putting too many nutrients in the water, causing eutrophication, as opposed to the much more desirable situation of a oligotrophic system with much clearer water and more desirable species. And you can see this in terms of the volume of anoxic water in the bay going between 1950 and into the current era. There's essentially almost no anoxic water at the bottom of the bay back in 1950, and now we're up to, these are billions of cubic meters of water. So this is a lot of anoxic water. Another way of looking at the same thing is looking at hypoxia, which is low oxygen water. Okay? Anoxic water is essentially void of oxygen. Hypoxia is lower than about 2 or 3 milligrams per liter, which is, let's say, about 20% of what normally you encounter. Again, from 1950, coming up into 1990, lots of hypoxic water, and it's remained about the same since we got in the 1990s. And this corresponds to the total nitrogen loading into the bay. So it's the nitrogen coming in the bay and phosphorus to some degree that's causing the growth of those algae, which then die, fall to the bottom, and they rob the water of oxygen. And you'll remember that when I talked about estrogen circulation, how the bottom waters don't flush out during stratification. So they build up this oxygen demanding waste. So what this looks like from looking down in the bay, if we could look at the deep waters, the red is low oxygen conditions or anoxia. And you can see here we are in June, already the upper portion of the bay, lots of anoxic water. Get into August, and this is this year, it extends much further down the bay. So quite extensive dead zones.
How do we measure that right now?
So, so the way you physically go out and do this is you take an oxygen meter and you can drop it down over the side or collect water, bring it to the surface and measure how much oxygen is in the water. Typically in the summer, if it was fully saturated with oxygen, you might expect about 6 milligrams per liter of oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, hypoxia starts around 2 milligrams per liter.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so you take a lot of samples across the bay, and you know what the volume of the bay looks like, how the volumetric map of the bay, the bathymetric map, and then you can spread those numbers out through the various depths to come up with a diagram like this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now we've used eutrophication to describe aquatic systems now for 100 years. But although the word's origin was in the medical field, it really became absent from medical descriptions in the 20th century. However, I revived that because it's apparent to me that the process of eutrophication is not only taking place in our aquatic systems, but it's also taking place within ourselves. So let's consider two individuals, one eutrophic and one ligotrophic, okay? And how they get there. Well, we know that the food system is causing eutrophication of the Chesapeake Bay because all the excess nutrients going in, right, fueling the algae. A similar kind of thing is going on with what the food system does to us. The standard American diet, which is a diet low in fiber, high in meat, high in sugar, high in fat, and high in salt. Okay, what that leads to is hypertension and clogged arteries. The number one cause of death in the United States and worldwide is coronary artery disease, a disease which is unknown in populations that eat plant-based. So this comes from eating animals. Okay. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which something like 2/3 of Americans will get before they die. And this again is associated with eating a meat-based diet and also with high fructose corn syrup and other refined sugars. Right? Type 2 diabetes, unknown in populations that eat plant-based diets, but something like 2/3 of Americans will die with either type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes. Kidney disease, again, very rare plant-based populations, those that eat animals, growing concern. Cancers, cancer rates are much higher on animal-based diets. Rheumatoid arthritis, again, much higher with animal-based diets. This is a autoimmune response, thinking that the animal products you're eating, recognizing those as antigens and then making a response to that. And when we do so, we attack our own animal cartilage, for example, the cartilage in our own body, as if it were cartilage that we were perceiving as a foreign body. And of course, erectile dysfunction, which is really a vascular disease and very rare in plant-based populations. The widespread nature of type 2 diabetes leads to amputation, right? Because of poor circulation to the extremities. Constipation, also associated with the standard American diet, again, because of a lack of fiber. Now, contrast to the oligotrophic person. They're lacking all the adipose deposits. No constipation here, 3 times a day with each meal. And what they're surviving on and thriving on is a high fiber diet with whole plants. Right? So here's again the analogs. Algal blooms of Eutrophic Chesapeake Bay. That's analogous to our fat deposits. Okay. Hypoxia in the bottom waters to the bacteria decomposing that algae, right? We also have hypoxia. If we are an obese person with poor circulation, there's hypoxia in our tissues. And again, that can lead to gangrene and amputation. Hydrogen sulfide bacteria. So in the large intestine of people, if they eat a whole plant-based diet, then the high fiber diet is turned into, by the bacteria there, it's turned into butyric acid. And butyric acid feeds the endothelial cells of the colon. Okay. However, if people eat a high animal-based product that contains more amino acids that are high in, that contain sulfur, and that causes the creation of hydrogen sulfide production in the intestine, which leads to precancerous lesions, polyps in the intestine. And on the bottom of the bay, the anoxic conditions cause for the production of hydrogen sulfide production by the bacteria that live there. Okay? And interestingly, the same research group that studies these sulfur bacteria in the bay and those in people are out of Johns Hopkins University, which is on Chesapeake Bay, and the very same scientists are doing both. So my analogy between the bay and between the body of water and the human body should not be so far flung, because we have scientists, same scientists studying both. Again, this excessive sedimentation, which comes with eutrophication, a lot of that, the algae that get decomposed, they end up in the sediments. That's analogous to the blocked arteries, which come from our animal-based diet, cholesterol mostly. So the USDA is charged with recommending what people should eat for a healthy diet, but they're also charged with promoting products from the agricultural system. They have monies which support tobacco, for example, the marketing of tobacco. And of course, nobody argues today that tobacco is anything but dangerous, right? So it's a conflicted organization. And so, their results, their recommendations rather, are conservative at best in terms of human health. But let's compare what they recommend and what people eat in the US. So people are only getting like a fifth of the vegetables they need, okay? And about the same with fruits, maybe slightly more fruits, okay? Their total grains are up because these are mostly refined, okay? But when you take the refined grains out, people are not eating the whole grains. People are eating way too much protein. Even people that eat plant-based get twice the amount of protein they need. USDA would like to see people eat more oils. I'm not sure that's really necessary or a good thing. But look at the added sugars. Their recommendation, this is on percentage of population, right? According to them, 30% of the population is eating an appropriate amount of added sugar, while 70% is eating too much. Well, honestly, there is no appropriate amount of added sugar. Let's be honest about that. I have a whole chapter on sugar, but I won't get into it now. And saturated fat, eating way too much saturated fat, way too much sodium. You think of pepperoni pizza, that's what people are eating.
Yeah.
Low in fiber, low in fruits, low in vegetables, and high in saturated fats and salt, and even sugar in the tomato sauce. So this animal-based standard American diet is making us sick. It's killing us. And let's look at 1990, what the adult obesity rate was. 11%, higher in the Chesapeake Bay. Again, we have a higher African-American population, a higher Hispanic population than average, and both those populations tend to suffer higher obesity rates. Okay. In 2017, it's gone up by almost a factor of 4 in the US, 4 times as many people obese as in 1990, just 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. And it's parallel to the Chesapeake Bay, right? I don't have older numbers on child obesity, but you can see, 15 to 20% of children now are obese. It's not just overweight. Okay. Mm-hmm. Adult obesity for African Americans, we're looking at nearly half the population. Latinos, again, Latinx people, nearly half the population in the U.S. A little bit lower, better in the Bay. Mm-hmm. And for white Americans, not as high, but still, again, 3 times or higher than what it was. And of course, as a consequence, we're seeing heart disease being very high in the Chesapeake Bay as well as in the U.S. Cancer deaths being high in the Bay. Strokes being high. Adult with type 2 diabetes. We're looking at like 11% of our population now. Again, a disease that doesn't exist in plant-based populations. Okay. And then hypertension as well, which is associated with that diet. So what are the leading causes of death? As I mentioned before, number 1 is coronary artery disease. Right now, the COVID pandemic has killed 240,000 people in the U.S. Mm-hmm. It will still not kill as many people as die from coronary artery disease.
Yeah, that's wild.
It's completely preventable and also reversible. Studies showing that people with coronary artery disease put on a whole plant-based diet have actually had plaque reduction and major symptom relief. Mm-hmm. And the same is true for type 2 diabetes, many of the cancers. Okay. So this diet is keeping us on perpetual medication. 57% of adults take at least 1 med per day. 11% take 5 or more per day. For people 65 and over like me, 92% are on 1 med a day, and 40% are on more than 5 meds a day. And this has important implications for aquatic systems because many of these medications pass through us and into the receiving waters. And many of them are endocrine disruptors. We have problems with transgender fish in the Washington, D.C. area, for example, and a longstanding problem there. And many they can play havoc with natural waters in many ways. Mm-hmm. So 6 of the top 10 drugs taken by people are all because they eat animal-based diets. So these drugs are treating hypertension, cholesterol, GERD, which is a acid reflux disease, and type 2 diabetes. So 6 of the top 10 could be eliminated if people ate a diet that would be good for themselves as well as the Bay. Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned, much of that pollutes the Bay. So it turns out through various studies, vegans, plant-based people live 6 to 9 years longer than omnivores, sometimes better in some studies. And they avoid the detriments of too much protein in their diet, too much, of course, cholesterol, which is absent in plant-based foods, heme iron, which is a carcinogen, promotes heart disease, etc. And they get all the benefits, fiber, antioxidants, omega-3 fatty acids. So we need to say no to fertilizers and junk food. And yes to a high fiber diet, both for us and for the bay. So before eutrophication, a lot of the food entering the bay was detritus, dead material from the plants that naturally grow there. A high fiber diet for the bay. Okay. So my next story is on animal agriculture and changing climate. This is about a mile from my house. This is a fish processing place, fish landing place. This is called sunny day flooding. There was no rainstorm. What this is, this happens on a regular basis now. During periods of high astronomical tides, the water is escaping the banks of the bay and onto land. And that's for two reasons. One, the area around the bay is subsiding because of how the bay was formed. I won't get into that. But mostly because of sea level rise. And the sea level, of course, is rising because warmer water is less dense and expands, and higher temperatures are promoting the melting of frozen water stored on land, snowfields and glaciers. So here is sea level rising, and this is at Sewell's Point, across the bay from me in Virginia. You can see how sea levels come up in the last 100 years. And of course, this is because it's getting warmer. This is mean air temperature in Baltimore, one of the major cities on the bay. And so we're up by like 4 degrees. Water temperature up by about the same amount. This is the Patuxent River, just one of the tributaries where we have data set for. And what's this got to do with our food system? Everything. So livestock accounts for 14.5% of all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. This is more than the 12 or 13%, which is attributes to all the transportation sector, automobiles, trains, planes, ships, the whole, put all those together, that's less greenhouse gas production than comes from animal agriculture. And it comes in various ways. Nitrous oxide, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, its main source, anthropogenic source, is that from over-fertilizing lands. Okay, so while croplands can sequester, take up some of the excess carbon dioxide and even methane, and they're big sources of nitrous oxide. And on the net are the largest really controllable problem of greenhouse gas emission that we have. So let's look at the greenhouse gas mitigation potential of different diets. And the Mediterranean performed very poorly on this one, and I think it's how they structured it. But anyways, but pay attention that the best thing to do to mitigate climate change is, by and large, vegan diet. So this is greenhouse gas equivalence in terms of carbon dioxide. Okay. If you can't go vegan, at least go vegetarian, and then maybe flexitarian. But you see, the more plant-based, the better it is for greenhouse gas production. Now, animal agriculture damages the environment in many ways, not just in terms of greenhouse gas production. Okay? And it's ruminates that are the worst. So these are cattle and sheep, the primary ones. And these have special compartmented stomach where microbial community grows to ferment the food they eat. And that enables them to get a lot more of the nutrition out of the food, but in doing so, it produces a lot of methane, and that's the largest source of greenhouse gas production. So cattle are the worst. And take a look. Also, land use, ruminant meat, again, cattle, most of the land for animals goes for cattle, followed by pork and chicken, etc. This is for them to live and also for them to where the food's produced. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Plant-based foods, very little impact. You don't need much land to grow for a plant-based diet. Greenhouse gas emission equivalents, you could see, it's all about the animal foods. Again, the worst is the ruminant meat. Eutrophication potential. This is in terms of phosphorus, which is more of a freshwater issue. But look, it's also about the ruminants, right? This is what, of course, is eutrophying the bay, these nutrients coming in. Okay. And plants-based diets, not nearly as much. Energy use. In other words, this is supplemental energy. Energy subsidized. Fossil fuel energy. Okay. It takes all this fossil fuel energy to produce ruminant meat and these other animal products, and very little fossil fuel energy to produce plants in comparison. Acidification potential. So some of these gases, sulfur-containing gases, particularly nitrogen-containing gases, they dissolve in the water and make sulfuric and nitric acid, etc. And they acidify the water. So again, that's associated with animal production and only a little bit with legumes, like beans, peas, those, but really mostly with animal production. Total water footprint, how much water does it take to make these things? Ruminant meat, again, the dominant user of water in the food system, followed by eggs. Look at that. Okay. And then we come into some of the other species of animals. And most plants, other than nuts take a lot of water.
Yeah, I heard the almond thing in like California, right?
Yeah. Still a lot less than it takes to make dairy. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So eating plant-based is the way to go. But in terms of your health, look closely at what you eat as an alternative to eating animals. So this is a table that shows, let's say, a Burger King burger here with a soy burger over here. And it could be a black bean burger. It'd be about the same numbers, okay? And then the two new synthetic vegan burgers on the market, okay? So in terms of calories that they supply you when you eat them, well, you're getting the most calories actually from eating the Beyond Burger because they have a lot of fat that they add to that, okay? It's actually just a little bit worse than eating a Burger King burger, okay? Impossible Burger is about the same. Look, if you eat a plant-based burger, you're like half the calories, okay? Protein concentration. Well, you get as much protein in a soy burger as you do in, you get more than you do in a Burger King burger. Okay, quarter more. Okay, and it's the same for Impossible Burger and Beyond Burger. Total fat. Well, very little total fat in soy burger. Look at all this fat in the Beyond Burger and Impossible Burger. More fat than the Burger King burger because they're trying to make it very palatable, you see. More fat, more salt, more palatable. And look at all the saturated fat. More saturated fat in these two synthetic burgers than the Burger King burger. Okay. Fiber, of course, highest in the soy burger, a little bit less so in these, and of course, very little in the Burger King burger. Greenhouse gas production, it's essentially the same for the three non-meat based burgers, much higher for the animals. And how much gasoline does it take to produce? Well, if that Burger King burger seems greasy to you, it should, because it takes 1.2 liters equivalent of gasoline, of fossil fuel, to make that burger. You think about that. Okay.
It's like 50 times more. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So very little for any of the plant-based. So, okay. Is it better to eat Beyond Burger, Impossible Burger for the environment? Absolutely. Is it better for your health? Marginally. Right? Okay. If it's a gateway for you to eating eventually a soy burger or something like that, then good. But don't expect you're going to lose weight on eating these things, or that you're going to, solve some of your other health problems that you certainly could by switching to a completely plant-based diet.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to stop our flow, but I just realized the time. I do have something at 1:30. Do you know how many slides there are left, or how many?
Almost at the end.
Amations. Okay.
Okay. So Chesapeake Bay food system, I create a sustainability spectrum here. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So the worst thing to eat, ruminate animals and their secretions. A little bit better to eat poultry, sort of, for the environment, not so much for the chickens. Animal fed aquaculture, a little bit better. Plant aquaculture, a little bit better. Hunting and fishing, ethical problems, a little bit better for the environment. Highly processed food, not so good for you. Chemical agriculture, not as good as organic agriculture, whole plant-based.
Mm-hmm.
So figure out where your diet is along the spectrum. And if you want to live sustainably and live healthy, you want to be on this end. So eat whole plant-based foods. Make sure that you include a B12 supplement. B12 is only made by fungi and bacteria. And because we wash these off our foods, we don't get enough. So we got to take a supplement. Make sure you choose organic produce. Avoid eating highly processed foods. And of course, then read my book.
Mm-hmm. Is that really the end? We timed it perfectly. Yeah.
So a lot more stories in the book.
Yeah.
That I cover, and hope folks enjoy it.